Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this Women's Health Research Translation and Impact Network webinar. This one's on communicating research, knowledge translation, and the role of academic writing. So I see people are still dialing in and joining us. I'm going to kick off now, and I welcome your presence at this webinar. So my name's Sarah Larkins. I'm a health systems researcher and general practitioner based in Townsville, and I'd like to start by acknowledging country and acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live and work, and particularly the wisdom of the women and the older women and their relationship with country. So where I normally live and work, that's the Bindal and Wulgurukupa people up in Gurrumbabara or Townsville. I'm today sitting on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation in Naarm in Melbourne. So I'm very lucky today to be joined by a great panel. So we're going to have a very varied session going on today. And a very varied session going on today. The panel includes Professor Liz Tynan from James Cook University, Dr. Relma Harrington, Taylor Laurie, and Catherine Wilkes. So I'll just get them all briefly to introduce themselves. Liz?
Thanks, Sarah. Lovely to be here. I'm Liz Tynan from the Graduate Research School at James Cook University in Townsville, and lovely to be with you.
Thank you, Liz. Relma. You're on mute, Relma.
Hello, everyone. I'm Relma Harrington, from a midwife and nurse from the Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Relma, and a recent PhD graduate.
Yes.
Taylor.
G'day everybody, that is hello and Gumbanga. My name is Taylor. I'm a researcher and I'm based at the University Centre for Rural Health in Lismore, but work with James Cook Uni and work with Sydney Uni as well in data translation. Lovely, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Taylor. And last but not least, Catherine.
Hi everybody, my name's Catherine. I'm joining you from Gallinani-esque in Queensland. I've been providing the project support for the James Cook Uni Place-Based Planning Project for Health in Claremont.
So thank you very much. We've got a great panel for you today with all that. And what we were asked to talk about academic writing today, and have taken a little bit more broadly to really think about communicating research more broadly and the role of that in knowledge translation, including the role of academic writing. So we have some learning objectives there for you, and in a session that I think is going to be very engaging. So I'm going to do a little introduction to communicating research and how and why and who we should communicate to. Then I'm going to hand over to Liz, who's going to talk about, is a real expert in academic writing and how best to do that, how to communicate clearly. And as a published book author with a couple of books under her belt, she's very well placed to do that, and has also worked with generations of PhD students over the years. Then we're having a panel discussion with questions from the audience, and Relma's going to talk from her experience about academic writing beyond English as your first language. Taylor's going to talk about visual communication for diverse audiences. And Catherine's going to talk from a consumer point of view about what consumers are looking for when it comes to research communication. At this stage during the panel discussion, I invite questions from the audience, the webinar audience, and if they can be submitted through the Zoom Q&A, we'll be able to have a panel discussion with all our panelists, including Liz at that time. So why is effective research, why is effective research communication important? Why do we talk about it? We all agonize over our research. We spend a long time designing it. We've spent a long time writing it up, as Liz is going to talk about producing theses and so on. Here's Relma, Dr. Relma Harrington, on the occasion of her PhD graduation last year with some of her family and her advisors. So we spend a lot of time and effort doing it. But on its own, writing up research in an academic thesis does not necessarily lead to change in clinical practice or policy outcomes or the health of communities or individuals. Doesn't necessarily follow unless we take particular steps to make sure the information, the findings from our research is communicated to all the people that need to hear it. So communicating research is part of the broader category of knowledge translation. And there's been a lot written. Many of you will have heard about knowledge translation. But broadly, this is thinking about the synthesis, exchange, application, and dissemination of knowledge acquired through research for the purposes of making things work better. So to improve health, or to improve the healthcare system, or to improve health service delivery. Now, when we're talking about research communication, we're talking about all of these kinds, but particularly dissemination that goes on at the end of a research project, but also knowledge exchange, the two-way sharing of knowledge between research producers and users. And we really need to be thinking about a strategy for communicating our research findings at all stages of research design and conduct. The audience, so thinking about the audience and who you want to communicate your research findings to is really important. And this will determine how best you might choose to communicate. So it's very important that you know your audience. Think about who you want to communicate your messages to. Is it academic colleagues? Now, it might be really important for you to communicate with your academic peers, whether it's locally in your own institution, whether it's nationally, whether it's internationally across borders, for the purposes of furthering knowledge and improving awareness in the field of the findings of your research. Perhaps it's policymakers that you want to communicate particularly with, to make sure that your research is possible to be translated into policy. And again, this will influence how you might communicate your findings. Perhaps it's healthcare providers, to make sure that your findings are put directly into clinical practice. And you might do that through evidence-based guidelines. You might do that through journal club presentations locally with healthcare providers. Perhaps it's with community members or participants in the research, thinking about how, in fact, what their participation has helped us to discover, and how that might be used by the community to take things forward. And the project we've been working on with Catherine has been doing a lot of this work. Perhaps it's peak bodies and advocacy groups, non-governmental organisations. There's a whole lot of other potential audience members that we might be wanting to communicate with. And all of these will alter how we might choose to communicate our research findings. So depending on the audience that you've decided about for your communication message, this will influence deeply how you might choose to disseminate the information, having thought about how that audience might like to receive information. So for an academic audience, academics quite like academic peer-reviewed journal articles. There's some certainty and confidence that comes from a knowledge translation that has gone through that peer review process and is published in a reputable journal. But that's likely to be fairly meaningless to people in a community in rural Solomon Islands or rural Australia. Perhaps people want to hear a story accompanied with some visual narratives, and this is some beautiful work from Taylor, who you'll hear from later, and she may use this as an example. Perhaps people want to hear an oral presentation with a few visuals, or perhaps translated into a one-page policy brief that might help policymakers quickly understand the issue, understand what's been done and the findings, and what they should do as a response to that. Perhaps people actually want to hear about the research in the form of a yarn, sitting around and having a talk. So this is actually a photograph from my PhD research some years ago, sitting around with some young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents and discussing how we both design and reported on the research. So it was all about young Indigenous parents. So all of these might be important. There's a whole lot of others. So perhaps you want to do a pamphlet or a radio story or a YouTube clip. There's a whole lot of possible ways that you might want to disseminate the findings of your research. So I'm going to pull up at that point and hand over to Professor Liz Tynan to just talk a little bit about academic writing and how we focus on clarity in academic writing for the purposes of ensuring that the work can be published and will be received by many people. So thanks, Liz. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm really pleased that you've placed quite an emphasis there on the needs of the audience. And that's something I feel very strongly about myself. Just to frame what I'm going to talk about in my little segment, this is a quote from a wonderful book called The Sense of Style by Steven Pinker. I do commend it to anyone who wants to polish up their own writing. And he said, writing succeeds when it aligns language with the truth, the proof of success being clarity and simplicity. And those two words, clarity and simplicity, combined with a really good understanding of your audience, I think these are the key. And it doesn't really matter what sort of writing you do. I do a lot of my own academic writing, and I have written textbooks, but I also write history books. And I always foreground the reader, because there's no point otherwise. It becomes an exercise in just satisfying your own writing needs rather than thinking about the reader. So I think it's really important that we consider the reader. So if you just move to the next slide, thanks, Sarah. Now, for those of you who are in the audience, it will be no surprise to hear that that being a researcher, perhaps doing a research degree or being an early career or mid-career researcher, involves two equally important activities. And the researchers must not just do research, but they must write research as well. And that sounds rather simplistic, but there's a world of meaning behind that. There are very few other professions that require that every stage of one's work be so meticulously documented and argued. And so there are quite strong guidelines around what is needed for really good, clear, simple academic writing. So to the next slide, thanks, Sarah. Now, I've got very little time, and of course, I run workshops in this area, and Relma well knows that last for many weeks because she's been to many of my workshops. But I just wanted to boil it down to some simple ideas just to, provide some food for thought for those who are wanting to do academic writing. And it really helps, I think, to prepare your take-home messages. So the way you organise your research paper is going to be driven by your results, obviously, and by the small number of take-home messages that arise from those results that you wish to convey. I always like people in my classes to do thought experiments, including this one, where you're imagining your paper being discussed at a journal club meeting in Johannesburg or Montreal or somewhere else in the world. And you really want the people at those journal club meetings, you know, other groups of researchers, people perhaps doing research degrees, to really get to the essence of your research. What do you want them to focus on? So think about what those things are, and then you control the narrative of the paper when you are able to very clearly express those take-home messages. I find it's very helpful to prepare clear statements of these first before proceeding with the paper itself, or any other kind of academic writing that you're doing. But just thinking for now about research papers, it is really helpful if you can bring those ideas to the fore, really think about what you're trying to convey, think about how your paper is going to be received by the audience. The audience has to drive a lot of what you're doing here. Next slide, thank you, Sarah. So it's really important that you do a fair amount of reflexive questioning of your own work. You're going to be asking a lot of questions. And one of the first questions, of course, is what do my results say? So it's very helpful if you can sum up precisely what you have found. 2 sentences, you know, I'm not kidding. If you can actually draw out the essence. And sometimes when we do research, and I know what it's like, and any other researcher here knows that we do get lost in the detail quite often. You need, as academic writers, you need to be able to step back and be able to say precisely what you have found very succinctly and very clearly. And what do these results mean in their context? So how do your results relate to existing knowledge? And just make clear statements. You don't have to include them in your paper. This is to help you get focused. You may include them potentially, but what you're going to be doing is just making sure that you fully understand your own research and exactly what you've found. And then you're going to consider who needs to know these results. So who exactly is your audience? Because so much of what you do is framed by the needs of the audience. And it's really important that you have a very clear idea. So that means, of course, understanding the journals in which you're going to be publishing, making sure you're targeting the right journals, knowing who is reading those journals and exactly what those journals require as well. And then you're going to think about, why do they need to know? I mean, obviously, all researchers want to improve things in their discipline and improve things for the end users. And so think about what contribution your work is going to make to others in the field. And as someone who has taught academic writing for quite a few years now, I know that this is sometimes the hardest thing for people to grapple with, because it almost feels presumptuous thinking about how your own work is going to help someone else. But it is actually an essential part, I think, of being an academic writer and researcher, is being able to identify the end use of your research so that you can very clearly channel your research in the right direction. So just the next slide now, Sarah, thank you. So just very quickly, I'm introducing this idea of the IMRAD system only because it does help to structure what you do. And having a structure is, you know, I think halfway to getting the job done. The IMRAD system is the usual way that papers, research papers, are structured. Now, some disciplines rearrange the elements, but it doesn't matter. All these elements are going to appear somewhere in the paper. So the I part is the introduction, and that deals with what question or problem was studied and why. So the answer will be in the introduction. The M part relates to the method. So how is the problem studied? So that will be the M part of IMRAD. And then we get to the findings, which are found in the results. That's the R part of the acronym. And then finally, we have the discussion. What do the findings mean? You can see now that you can actually take apart your research and work on each of these sections separately. I find this enormously helpful to be able to take the paper apart conceptually and focus on one particular area, and then you can sort of work your way outwards from there. So I'm going to just talk in a little more detail about what each section involves. So the next slide, thanks. So the introduction is going to obviously introduce the topic and define terminology, relate the topic to existing research, indicate the focus of the paper and the research objectives. And then if we think about the methods section, I think of this as the kind of, I'm a former science journalist. And so I think of this as kind of the journalistic part, where you're talking about who, what, where, how, why. So this part is going to provide sufficient detail for competent researchers to repeat whatever you've done. It doesn't have to be an experiment, of course, but however you have gathered your data. And it answers those very important questions of who, what, where, how, why. So then we move on to the results section, which gives summary results in graphics and numbers, compares different treatments if relevant. Of course, results actually vary enormously depending on exactly what you've been doing in your research. This part, if it's relevant, you may be providing quantified proofs or statistical results at this point. That doesn't apply to everyone, but that's, if you do that kind of project, that's where you're going to put it. And then the hardest part to write is the discussion. The discussion, of course, is also often called the synthesis, and this is where everything comes together. This answers the research questions and objectives that you've set out earlier in the paper. It explains discrepancies. It states the importance of discoveries and implications and makes strong statements. I always like to see people make very clear, strong, unambiguous statements in the discussion. Now, the discussion does not have to be very long. In fact, I would say, and other researchers here may agree or disagree, I'm not sure, but I think in most cases, journal articles are getting shorter. And so whereas once we might have seen a 10,000 word paper, it's much more likely these days to be 5,000 to 6,000 words. And that is actually genuinely difficult to write that succinctly, and especially to write a very succinct synthesis or discussion at the end. And that does require quite a bit of thinking, obviously, of discussion with colleagues, and that sort of reflexive approach of going back over, asking questions, probing what you've found, and constantly referring back to existing scholarship as well. And through that means, which is, it always seems to take a little longer than people think, particularly when they're new to this area. But through when doing that in a very rigorous and determined way, that's where you add to the fund of human knowledge in your field. And that is where the rubber hits the road in terms of new understandings. So all of these take a little bit longer than perhaps originally envisaged by many people starting out. But over time, you will discover what works for you and the best sort of pacing that you can apply to this work. I personally think that, and if you just go to the next slide, I'll make this point, and this won't surprise you because I'm an academic writing teacher. So writing early is really important, I think. This helps smooth the process, but it's not just that. It's your research, when your research is still in progress, it is actually easier to really grapple with some of these ideas as you're working through. And so everything's fresh in your mind. If you're working with colleagues, as most people are, they're around, you can talk to them. I always remember many, many years ago, I worked at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. I was actually the science communication manager. I wasn't a scientist myself, but I would go out with the researchers on the research vessels, and they would have a day scuba diving on the reef and, going to their experimental sites and recording data on their little clipboards. And then they would come up after all of that, exhausting day generally, and they get out of their wetsuits, and the first thing they would do would be to start writing. And they would sit around the table and they would talk, but they'd also be writing. And that stuck with me when I became a researcher myself a little bit later. And in my own case, I'm a historian of science. And so my work takes place in archives, and I always have a notebook with me. I'm always writing. I'm always recording everything. I will not remember it later. I know that about myself. So you have to do it while everything's fresh in your mind. And always have that notebook by your side as you go, no matter what sort of research you're doing. I keep it at home, and if something occurs to me in the middle of the night, which is not that uncommon, I'll always be sure to make a note, because we deal with a great deal of complexity as researchers, and it's really important that we have a way of recording it and making sure that we don't miss anything. And also, the writing process itself shows up problems with your data and with the research design. Any problems are going to become more apparent as you're actually doing the research. I don't subscribe to the idea of writing up at the end. I subscribe very much to writing through the process. And hopefully by the time you come to the end, you have a much deeper understanding, because you have gone through that sort of reflexive process that takes you right through to the end. So I think I'm just about out of time now, Sarah. So I'm going to hand back to you, but thank you very much, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Liz. That's really a helpful discussion about that research communication that involves clear academic writing, be it for a thesis or be it for an academic publication, and that advice to start early and write throughout, I think, is incredibly valuable. That some of us take longer to learn than others, but it's very, very helpful to remember that. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Relma Harrington, and we've put a little map up. But Relma's coming to us today from Honiara, but will tell us a little bit about her journey. Now, this is the first bit of a panel discussion where we're going to hear from Relma and Taylor and Catherine about their relevant areas of expertise. So they're each going to speak for around 5 minutes on their relevant areas of expertise, and then we're going to start a discussion involving all 4 of our panelists. And I invite you as audience to submit any questions you have for any one of us through the question and answer Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll address those during the discussion. So just pop them in the chat as you're listening to our speakers. So firstly, we've got Relma talking about the experience of communicating research when your first language isn't English and you've got to communicate to a variety of audiences. Then we've got Taylor and then Catherine, and I'll introduce them in turn. So firstly, over to Relma.
Thank you, Sarah. I think firstly, I would like to just share an experience that I had previously in my undergrad when we started off learning about academic writing before excuse me, our university entrance. At that time, I had a colleague from the Solomon Islands. And during our discussion, when we discussed about academic writing, trying to understand what we acquire or learning in English, and then trying to process that understanding in the context where we come from and what background information we had. And then one of my colleagues said that, man, I just couldn't understand this English and writing it out in English. So he said, what I will do, I will have to write it in my own dialect, the local native dialect first. And then he translated it into the local Pidgin English, Solomon Islands Pidgin English. And then from there, he then write out the sentences or paragraphs in English. At first, we just joked and laughed about this experience, but then when I actually did my PhD, I think I can appreciate and acknowledge that I think this represents the challenge we had as non-English speakers, trying to understand concepts in English and then write them in English terms, understand them in the English vocabulary, and be able to translate them or understand, to make sense of them in what it should be, like what should be understood, and then what we actually understand about matter. So I think it's a big challenge coming from a non-English speaker and then trying to write and understand things and process it and translate it in English. But after all, I can come and testify that this is where academic writing is critical to helping us in our communication so that we understand how we can communicate. So in my thesis writing, I think there's a lot that I've learned from Liz's academic writing tips, and some of these things that I've learned are like clarity, making things clear, conciseness, being concrete. And I think these are the things that have helped me. And I think one other thing that I also want to mention here was Liz always mentioned that removing the dead woods, in the writing. And as I transition along and then writing up this PhD and completing it, I also conducted interviews and I did my research in the Solomon Islands. And because I conducted interviews in the local Pidgin English, I actually transcribe my interviews in the Pidgin English and then translate them. And then later translate them to English. So understanding what I'm doing in my research is the first important thing, and being able to articulate what I actually mean when I write the results as to how am I going to write it in the thesis. I think that's critically important. But for me, like after completing this thesis with the assistance of learning how to write in academic style, but then I have to take that result back and then translate it to different audiences. And I think this is the challenge again, where I will come back to academic writing. How can I make this simple? How can I make this clear so that what I'm intending to communicate is actually what I'm communicating in terms of translating it into English and then probably into the local language, especially when disseminating in conference presentation or with a different audience, so that what I'm presenting is consistent and then it's clear and then it is able to make changes down the line with whatever the audience that the result can be presented to. So yeah, so I can say here that academic writing actually bridges research knowledge and practice. For me, coming from a non-English speaker, I think that can give or provide a consistent understanding of my results that I found in communicating them to whatever different audiences, but then it will be clear and consistent and made sense as to what can be done in practice. I think that's all I can say here. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Relma. That's helpful. And looking at this map, Relma's hometown is up in Choiseul, right up in the outer northwestern part of the Solomon Islands, and she's lived and worked at Twifi on Malaita for many years and is now in Honiara. And her research on sexual and reproductive health services for women in the Solomon Islands was a pleasure to supervise, and I've seen in practice how well Relma has been able to code shift, if you like, between working with people and health workers in the Solomon Islands and reporting findings back to them in ways that make sense. while also publishing in Western academic journals and writing a successful PhD thesis. So thank you, Relma. Remember to keep the questions coming. Now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Taylor Laurie, our young ball of energy and creative genius in northern New South Wales, to talk about communicating visually and to diverse audiences. Taylor,
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
And thank you, Roma, too. That was so wonderful hearing your journey. So I'm Taylor. A lot of my work revolves around non-traditional research outputs and looking at the value that they hold when it comes to communicating research and communicating ideas, especially to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I've got a big vested interest because I'm Aboriginal as well. And so to be able to see a lot of the groundswell coming into research and wanting to adapt different ways of being, doing and knowing, and then disseminating that in alternative ways is really exciting for me. So how I work with, well, my approach, I suppose, is always acknowledging that country facilitates a lot of these yarns that we have, and it's very much so a place for groundedness and for really meaningful conversations to begin from. We have the support of community and the engagement of community in these discussions and health yarns more often. And culture is more a way of giving us a framework to work off and being able to relate research ideas from a Western world into what mob know best. So can I have the next? Oh yeah, here, Mullingu and Cairns. So I had the privilege of being able to go to Mullingu and sit in on one of the mums and bubs groups there. And I was very much so just a passive person. There was no big role for me apart from going and experiencing and supporting the crew. But I ended up, and I have this habit of ending up sitting and drawing what I hear. And so from the women's yarns, and we did these in 2 sessions. The one on the left was the first session that we did that was talking about just these acts of listening to women, bridging gaps in health, and how do we do that? And how do we capture that? The hand-drawn bunch of scribbles on the right, it was the second session talking about what does it mean to have space held for women and for their babies in this process? How do they understand how research works? And some reflections on the process of coming from a community space and having to adapt to different workflows in different spaces in research. So that was the what we call generative scribing, and I love that. But these posters, were created during a workshop. The first instance was definitely just a more raw form of generative scribing, and to have a process where I could double check with the aunties or the dubs or the women on board with their babies, and capturing essence especially was a big concern of mine, because when we're working with so many different communities, I want to ensure that their local practices and cultures and dynamics are really captured properly, because mob is so diverse from everywhere. And just checking in real time was a real privilege. We don't get to do that often. So yeah, it was definitely an experience that had changed how I had seen non-traditional research outputs. At the very beginning, it was a very novel, innovative, fun idea with a lot of momentum. And so I jumped right into that because I love that. Whereas now it's definitely a practice that I think can make great impact. It's just learning how to measure that impact. But yeah, so yarning with the women were beautiful, and being able to see these yarns in lifetime, get scribbled up and drawn and have that reflected. And often these, especially the digital versions, they're easy enough to pull apart. So if any of the services or any of the women wanted one particular bit of the graphic, easy enough to wipe the rest and blow that aspect up. So they could put that up in their clinics or put them up in schools or even at home, and have that sense of pride and ownership over the work that we collaboratively do. So yeah, that's me. I'm here for any questions. I love talking about data translation and graphics. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Taylor. And that work that Taylor was talking about was part of the Women's Action for Mums and Bubs project, the WOMB project, which was asking Aboriginal women in communities around Australia what they thought would improve mums and bubs health. So, you know, again, a relevant project and reporting back to community. And Taylor's also been doing quite a lot of storyboard work and YouTube videos for us, reporting other quality improvement work, and we're finding that, you know, this real mixture of communication works very well for community members and clinic staff that we work with. So now we'll come to Catherine Wilkes, and who has worked as our person on the ground in Claremont for the place-based planning work that we've been doing in Claremont community, and really acting as that bridge between community and the research team as part of the research team. So Catherine, over to you to talk about what communities want when hearing about research.
Thanks, Sarah. Taylor, that was amazing. You've got my attention right from the start. It's novel, it's relevant, and you know, if I'd certainly be looking at that feedback and taking that on board. I guess community, what they want to know is what's in it for me. So Liz talked about making your message clear, making it simple. The old KISS principle comes into play, you know, keep it simple, stupid. I think it really does depend on who your audience is. If you're looking at a mums and bubs group, then use the Mums and Bubs Facebook page to get in touch with them, ask to sit down with them and have a you know, meet them at their play group and things like that, to actually just go and sit and talk to them, because you know, every mum wants to know what's the best practice, because they want to do what's best for their kids. And you know, unless, what's that old adage, when you know better, you do better. So I think it's important that you make sure that you're clearly stating what's the benefit of my research for you and your community. How is it going to impact on what the community's going to do? With the place-based planning project for health that we've been involved in, community, it was really difficult to get a lot of people to the workshops. We had different workshops at different times, which was great, because there were people that were working, or people, you know, that had family commitments. So coming along to the evening ones was better. So we had an evening session followed by a morning session. We also had online options for people who couldn't attend. That's really important. Taylor's video page there, that would really grab my attention. And I think having a flyer or something on a Facebook page or a QR code, one of the hangovers of COVID is we're all adept at using QR codes now. So put a one-page flyer about your outcomes clearly on that, and people can read it at their own leisure while they're waiting to pick up kids and you know, from school or something like that. I think the other thing too is, depending on what your target audience is, use the best media or the best method to get in touch with them. So we've talked about, you know, going along to a Mums and Bubs group or having a workshop where you will give feedback. But it might be as simple as in our community, we've got the hack coordinator. She has a newsletter that she puts out, and it's got a circulation of 100 people. You know, if you put a little comment in that newsletter, there's 100 people plus that you're reaching. And again, use your stats, but make it clear, you know. That in our community particularly, we've gone through the place-based planning project for health. We've been involved in the co-design process. We've kept going back to the community and to the participants and to the stakeholders and checking in with them all the way along. But what community want now is they want to use that data, and they want to use the information so that we can lobby with the state and federal government, for the funding bodies, to get improved health outcomes. And that has taken effect, because based on the data that the research team were able to get, Mackay Health looked at the primary presentations at our hospital, and they have worked with a provider, and we have now had a second surgery reopened. So, you know, it's very powerful, and community want that information because they don't want it just for themselves for now. They want it for the future. They want it for, you know, they want to be making sure that the services that are going into the future are going to be adequate for their families. And I think, you know, using those infographics, as I said, making use of the QR codes, also just checking in. School newsletters are a great way to get information out into the community. And also, if you can, find a community connector to make sure that you're touching base with the relevant stakeholders and the different people, that, you know, the necessary stakeholders and service providers that you need to be involving as either part of your research or as part of your feedback.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Catherine. And we've seen Catherine and the team sort of put many of those strategies into practice. You know, the local newspaper, local rag, that school newsletters, radio stations, and so on, to get those clear messages about both process of research to get people involved, but also findings and outcomes of the research to the community members and participants. So thank you very much to our panelists. I'm just going to the chat. We have a question there. What do we include? Where do we include our conclusions in the IMRAD system of reporting? And I'm going to hand that one to Liz, as right up her alley. Liz?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the questioner. So different journals do things slightly differently, and sometimes there is a separate conclusions section as well as discussion. But I would say, for the most part, you'll be looking to use your discussion as the place where you reveal your conclusions. Mind you, I do talk to people that it's sometimes surprising that you don't really withhold your conclusions. You know, you reveal them in a sense in your abstract, and you can also talk about them in your introduction. So they permeate the whole document. But the discussion is where you're really getting to that synthesis, and that includes the conclusions, but it's rather more than that as well. And from that slide, you remember some of the other things that are involved in that section. So yes, your conclusions are very much, you know, important for the whole document, from the abstract right through to the discussion.
Excellent. There's another question directed particularly to Taylor about the what platform technology Taylor used to create the your beautiful visuals. T, do you want to
Thinking for trade secret? Oh,
Yeah.
no, Kevin. No, I use Canva. I find that Canva is a very user friendly interface, and there's a lot of flexibility, especially with the new draw function that they've managed to slide in there. So yep, go and grab a Canva subscription. It's very, very easy. Doesn't take up a lot of space either, but can export graphics very large.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So a follow-up question is what is the role of advisors or supervisors, given that in the academic world where there is a bit of an emphasis on academic publication, what is the role of advisors in working with candidates to improve clear communication in theses or in publications and presentations? And I think I'll throw that one first to Liz, but also then to Relma, perhaps, for a bit of a comment from her point of view as well. Liz?
Yes, thank you. So it's a partnership between the candidate and the advisor, and we here at JCU tend to think of it as advisors and candidates rather than supervisors and students. So there's a sense that the PhD or master's candidate is an emerging researcher, and that they will be publishing, and that part of the guidance that they receive and the sort of collegial relationships they develop with their advisory team will involve learning how to write, and that they will probably, in fact, in just about every case, I think their papers are going to feature their advisors as co-authors. And this is an absolutely marvelous experience, you know, because the by definition, advisors at this university anyway are active researchers who are actively publishing, and so they have that wealth of experience, and then they are sharing that with their candidates and helping to build their writing abilities. I think it's a crucial relationship for developing those writing abilities. And of course, we have other supports here as well. And I'm part of that because I offer the writing and communication program here. But I think that crucial relationship between candidates and advisors is where that really important nurturing and mentorship comes from. So I'd be interested to hear Relma's take on that as well.
Any addition, Relma?
Yes, thank you, Liz. I think I would like to add 2 points here. Like one thing that helped me was getting my work to my advisors, and they see my writing regularly as I go, because I find this is important, because they will ask me questions about what I wrote, if it makes sense to my supervisor or advisors, and if they actually understand what I meant to write or what I'm thinking and writing, and its consistency. So that's one. The other one is, I think I had a bonus in my advisory team because one of my advisors understands my context, where I come from, and my language, the common language that we speak, the Solomon Island Pidgin. So because the Solomon Island Pidgin is sometimes sometimes presents as the opposite to English, especially with the meaning of what we say and speak it in English. It's quite the opposite in English. So I think in that space, my advisor actually guides me through, so that she actually checks on me. Do you really mean to say this, or you mean to say this, but that doesn't sit well in the academic writing or in English especially? Yeah, so that really helps. Well, I understand we cannot have all advisors to know the language of their students, but I think understanding the context and background would help.
That helps.
To assist in translating.
Thank you, Relma. I think we've got time for one more quick question. So we've talked a lot about a variety of communication styles, and one of the things that affects this is who reviews. You know, who reviews academic publications, and I'd be interested in any of your thoughts about how we work with editors of publications to incorporate communication styles and broaden the views, broaden the number of people who are involved as reviewers. Taylor, have you got any thoughts about that? I'm going to throw to you first.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think like Relma was saying, it's understanding that context. And if you're talking with somebody who's reviewing research outputs about, you know, being, you know, out bush up in Northern Territory surrounded by mob and so rich in culture, and then you're trying to convey that essence, perhaps some of that may get lost because there's a lack of that contextual experience. So I mean, I'm not quite sure how often reviewers can get out and about with research projects or field trips, but that would help, or having more exposure to on the ground people working with communities, and using different languages or different ways of capturing yarns and data. So I think just being curious and wanting to actively pursue new learnings would be something that I would hope would come about naturally.
Thank you, T. Catherine, anything to add, or Liz, anyone?
I think that there's probably quite a positive move towards broadening the availability or the sharing of research. And I just know from my own research, which is on nuclear testing in Australia, and which has, of course, taken place in Aboriginal homelands. So these days, as part of ethics processes and so on, and also just from the desires of the researchers, including me, is that there is now this drive to incorporate returning the research to those communities. And this is playing out not just in my area, but in every area that I'm aware of, where I talk to people, that there's a giving back. Instead of just researchers, in the past may have been more inclined just to take and not return. But I think all of us now are looking for ways to return that research to traditional owners and others from where the research originated.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists. I don't see any more questions. So it's time to wrap up now, and I hope you found it an engaging discussion. I think we've thought quite broadly about communicating research and how we might do it, and some of the take-home messages that we've got for you are really to spend some time thinking about your audience and who you're wanting to communicate to at a particular time, and what that means in terms of how you structure your communication and how you plan your communication. Because it's important to plan communication about research early and often. As Liz said, that's important in terms of academic writing. It's important in all forms of research communication. It's important to think about a variety of techniques and medias to really have a broad reach. So you don't want to reach a narrow segment of the population. You want to reach all the people who might be impacted by your research. Concentrate on clear, direct communication. You'll be interested as a research expert, you'll be interested in the nitty-gritty detail and all the little side bits, all the little rabbit holes that you go on as you're doing your research, but focus on the big picture, those 2 sentences of this was the problem, this is what I did, this is what I found, this is what it means. Have your work reviewed by a non-expert peer, so someone who's not a specialist in your topic should be able to read and understand your work. And importantly, it's very important to just persist, because inevitably, particularly when it comes to academic publishing, getting your work published in academic journals, there will be rejections. So it is important to develop a thick skin, take feedback as feedback, use it to improve your work, and try again somewhere else, because your work will find a home. So I'd like to finish. I've got a few resources there. We're almost out of time. All of us are associated with James Cook University and the Tropical Australian Academic Health Centre in some way, based up in North Queensland. We are part of the ARA Women's Health Network. And I would like to thank all the panelists very much for giving up their time today to share their knowledge, wisdom and experience of 5 great women to work with. And I would like to thank ARA and the Women's Health Research Translation Network for their support, and encourage you please to fill out the evaluation form online after this webinar. So thank you very much. And it's 2:59 and I'll say goodbye. So thank you very much. Bye-bye. Oh.